I'm Eleanor Wachtel, and I'm speaking to Tolu Oloruntoba about his prize-winning book, The Junta of Happenstance. Congratulations.
Thanks, Eleanor.
You were born and raised in Ibadan in southwestern Nigeria. When you think back to your childhood, what's your earliest memory?
I've often disputed this with my parents, what my earliest memory is, because they tell me it's improbable. But um, I remember getting stuck in a sofa, a one-seater sofa, um, and so I was laterally placed. I was playing in the living room, and then I somehow got wedged in the chair. Um, I could simply have folded my knees, I suppose, but I just sort of panicked because I was just wedged in the chair there. And they said, "We lived in that house when you were two. Um, you shouldn't and cannot possibly have memories from when you were two." But I do. So, anyway, that's my earliest memory. It's a memory of being trapped. Perhaps that's why, not to read too much into it, but I really dislike a feeling of being obstructed, of being trapped. Yeah, that's the word. But I'm probably reading too much into it again.
In the acknowledgments to your book, you thank your mother who taught you to write.
Yeah.
How how so? What did she do?
I mean, beyond the actual mechanics of writing alphabets and whatnot, I mean, she was responsible for helping me reinforce that apart from school. Um, but she taught me how to write essays. Really, when I was preparing to go into the university, and as young as when I was preparing to go into secondary school, um, she would teach me how to outline my thoughts and say, "Well, you need to prepare an outline if you want to write an essay." And I still turn to those I still turn to those lessons, whenever I have to write. It's that settling of myself. It's that structural thinking that I bring to the page. It helps me make some order out of chaos, and I believe that was the foundation of my writing, because then I was able to write essays, and there's that feeling of accomplishment when you write an essay and it's somewhat coherent, and you somehow wrote what you set out to write. That was empowering, and I believe all the other forms of writing that I do can be traced to that success that I found in being able to outline my thoughts and so forth. And so that's it.
And just to stay with acknowledgments for a moment, but you also thank your grandfather who sold books and taught you to love them.
Mm.
How did he do that? How did he infect you with a passion for reading?
He didn't do it deliberately. I mean, he was a very learned man who loved books, but he had this huge bookshelf in his living room, and we would visit him on holidays. And he had encyclopedias and novels, um, hundreds of them. And as a kid, I mean, the encyclopedias were very interesting because of they were illustrated encyclopedias, and I would flip through them, and I would read these novels. There were several novels in the African Writers series.
Mm.
There are dozens and dozens of novels in that series, and I somehow took it upon myself to read as many of the books on that list at the back of each of those books as possible. And I just continued to read, and I could tell he was happy I was doing that. Whenever I would go to his bookshelf and just pick a new one out and return the one I'd read, um, I just sort of stuck to it. And he had a bookshop the on the ground floor of his house, in which he would sell books to the public, and it was a very formative experience for me because didn't have a lot of age appropriate, I would say, books in my own house. We had a few, but the absolute bounty of his shelves was it was quite a gift for me. And so
You
I just
once
lost myself in them.
You once talked about, just in terms of the exposure to language and, in terms of nursery rhymes and an immersion in Yoruba culture, and I wondered what was the influence of Yoruba culture?
It was everywhere. I mean, I guess for the first 30 years of my life, I was immersed in Yoruba culture. I mean, my parents spoke it to each other. We didn't speak it as much to them for complex reasons. Uh,
Why now? Why?
uh, my dad had the impression that because he had difficulty learning English because Yoruba was his first language, um, it would be better if his children didn't have that challenge. And I, I applaud the desire that informed his policy. But then the way he made that happen was to forbid us from speaking Yoruba at home. Because I don't know, I'm just speculating here. He probably thought, we could only gain proficiency in one language. So English is my first language and it's his second. Um, but as we grew up, we just sort of began to ignore that, and we started to speak Yoruba a bit at home, to them. But initially, they would speak to us in Yoruba, and then we would answer in English, and it sort of made us the weird cousins. It was interesting. Anyways, so that's how come English is my first language. um, I would say though that that immersion in the culture meant I didn't have to learn it. I'd absorbed the language. I could understand it. I could speak it. I just didn't have the fluency that uh, a first speaker would have. But that's as far as language goes. As far as the culture goes, it was I was fully immersed in it, although I was in a sort of protected bubble from it. But things like music, the musicality, um, praise songs, talking drums. Um, my thoughts are trailing off somewhat, but it was living in a culture, with relatives that were fully steeped in it. And I got a fair bit of my early you know impressions molded by living within that culture.
And reading? Would you have read?
Yes, yes. I mean, I read Yoruba, and I read a few books, not as well as I'd like, but yes, and reading as well. There was a book of there was a Yoruba language book called what's it called? Alawiye, if I remember correctly. But it had Yoruba nursery rhymes, and my mom would be so proud when I recited those rhymes, off the top of my head, and it just sort of gave me that encouragement to continue to do that. She would make me perform for guests and so forth. So yeah, that was fun for me.
And writing, when did you start to think about putting words on a page?
From my early teenage years, the first art form that I really was serious about was visual art. So I used to draw a lot. I used to draw mostly comics, superheroes, and stuff. Um, but I kept being frustrated because I could create these characters, but I couldn't deploy them in a story. So it was just this character does this and has a sword and blah blah blah. And then what happens? I don't know. Um, so that became very frustrating because I knew that I couldn't really take that further if I didn't have a story. And so I started to my best friend and I started to collaborate on a fantasy novel together. And um, I guess the frustrations of being unable to have a coherent story forced us to try to write one of our own. And so that was my first real attempt at writing. And I tried poetry as well, and it was shorter. It was easier to. The barrier was lower for me, I would say, in that I didn't need to have the whole thing figured out. Um, I could. I sort of settled my way into it. I tried out one poem. It was short, and it worked. And all of a sudden, I had one poem. That was impressive. And so I sort of kept at it from when I was a teenager, and I just continued to do it. It became a great outlet for me, I would say, a way to process very complex emotions or complex information from all sources into something coherent, something that made some sort of sense.
You've talked about growing up in hard circumstances or with early trauma. How did that shape you as a young person?
How did it shape me? It misshaped me, I would say. I mean, I wish I didn't have to go through trauma to learn the things that I did and to become the kind of person that I have become. But in some ways, I look back and I see that I have more empathy than I would have otherwise. I I I tend to assume less. I tend to question my own rightness in any scenario. So there's that pause for is this the right thing? Am I correct? Is there more to this story? I tend to avoid the violences of toxic masculinity in which there's that desire to assert one's superiority almost. I tend to avoid such displays of dominance or such attempts to dominate the other. I don't know what would have been, but haven't seen what can happen when people abuse their power. I sort of resolved, no, not sort of, I absolutely resolved to not be part of that problem. Um, and so I grew up in a different way based off my resolutions. Uh, yeah, I just couldn't allow myself to become that. And so that has directly informed who I am today and how I view life.
More recently, you've said that writing was a way that you processed trauma, but back then, were those experiences what drew you to study medicine and become a doctor?
I, I wouldn't say so. I mean, I had the generic thoughts when I was, what, 14, 15, about um, helping people. That generic thing of, I want to help people. What does that mean? I want to help people. And so I had that thing, of course. So I knew I wanted to help people. When I started to think about what I wanted to study in the university, I knew I wanted to help people. I knew I wanted to, work with people and, help them solve their problems. And at that time, the options that I had top of mind were psychology or sociology. But when it became time to seriously consider, I had to choose between psychology and medicine, and I was prevailed upon by my father to study medicine because of my prospects, I guess, after university. Like, how would you be able how would you be able to guarantee that you would always have a job, something to that effect. And I was, what, 17 at the time, so our medical schools were run on the British system, so I went to med school as a teenager, so I didn't have as much agency. I certainly couldn't afford any alternatives on my own, and so I went to med school because I didn't want to go to engineering school. The major approved options would have been, like law, engineering, and medicine. And I was bad at math, so I was like, well, I guess it has to be medicine then.
And how was it? Was it a good fit? You spent 6 years
I
in med.
did. Was it a good fit? The answer is not simple, but I knew by my second year in medical school that I did not want to do this for a long time. In fact, I did not feel I wanted to be in medical school after the second year. Um, However, I did paradoxically enjoy medical school, just not that's it's just complex. Like I loved some of the subjects, some of the courses, like physiology. Um, it appealed to a part of me that longed to understand how things work. And so, going down to the cellular and even molecular level, um, how does a human being work? And then we did psychology as well. How does human mind work? Public health. How do aggregations of people work? It was all fascinating. It's part of the reason why I enjoyed geography and agriculture and biology in secondary school as well. Understanding how things work. So that helped me through anatomy. When I move my arm like this, why does it go like that? You know, that was fun. And then of course we started to interact with patients. No, first we had to interact with dead people, cadavers, and then patients. There was just a part of me that was uncomfortable with it because I had other interests. I was beginning to write a lot at that time. Um, you know, I had friends that had a lot of other interests, and I didn't really see myself being a physician. Um, I saw myself more as a writer or a creative type, but I stuck to it because I think I was good at it because I'm competitive, I think, and I tend to absorb information, especially when I have heard it as opposed to when I've read it. And so I attended all these lectures and word rounds and just absorbed all of that information. And I could reproduce enough of the information to convince my teachers that I would be a safe doctor. And so they gave me a medical degree. So, of course, I'm oversimplifying it. I think I think I was a good student. My heart just wasn't fully in it.
And you managed to find resources within the practice of medicine that you could apply to writing and whether to apply to your perceptions as a writer?
Always. I believe everything that happens to a writer is in some way fuel. Um, it's part of the narrative. It's part of what goes into production. It's part of what goes into the brain that associates different kinds of material and creates weird things. And so, having been immersed in medical school and medical practice for a total of 12 years, um, I could not avoid some of the language of medicine, some of the experiences I'd had, especially since I was so strongly disillusioned by my practice of medicine. I was in a scenario in which I could never do enough for my patients because the whole thing was broken. um, and because of my sense of morality, I took a lot of that personally. It felt like a personal failure in which I just could never do enough. So some of that regret, some of that bitterness, makes it into my work in which I talk about, like at the end of the book, I talk about in situ, talking about a failed country in which the members of my guild have fled. Referring to the brain drain, and doctors just find better jobs, better lives in other countries, and people that are left have to contend with uh, chaos, really.
And
Um,
it was medicine that took you to the United States. I mean, you applied to do graduate work,
yeah,
uh, and that brought you to the US. Was it hard to leave Nigeria, or was that what at that point you were ready to do?
I was ready. I tried for some years. I never quite got enough funding to be able to go. I wasn't rich by any stretch of imagination. So if I didn't, most of the years in which I got admissions, I didn't get scholarships or I didn't get enough in funding to be able to go. And so finally in 2014, I got, something close to a half scholarship. And I just put the rest of my money together. I, borrowed the rest. from people I knew and just left. I'm oversimplifying it because it was much harder than that.
Mhm,
But yes, in the final analysis, I wouldn't have gotten into grad school, into the program I got into with the funding that I received if I hadn't been to medical school and
mhm.
done the kind of work that I'd done after it. So it's all connected.
The title of this collection, the Junta of Happenstance. Why junta?
It's a nice. It has a nice sound. I mean, the connotation is.
It's a nice sound for a pretty bad thing. I mean,
I
it's
know, right?
about
It's
military taking power in a country and by force, and it's
yeah, yeah, and that was my lived experience growing up. Like I was born in 1985. In that year, another of a succession of dictators took over. Ibrahim Babangida, still alive today, by the way. Um, and for most of my childhood till at least 2000, 1985 to at least the late 90s. For most of that time, we were just a succession of dictators, sometimes more brutal than the last. And in the news, they'll call them, the military juntas. Decreed this. This is a new decree. This is banned. This is abolished. This is what you must do. So that concept of a junta was pervasive because it was in the news almost every day. Because this is the newest thing the junta has said. Of course, they used they called it junta, which I believe it will be a proper anglicization of that. And so that concept wasn't far from my mind, in which I guess I've been primed to look out for that kind of totalitarian rule. And in this case, I'm trying to describe the totalitarian rule of chance, or a kind of randomness, or a kind of enforced helplessness, or sort of enforced requirement to fashion one's life after the desires of others. It sort of takes away from one's agency, I would say, in which you know we feel competent, at least generally. We feel generally able to do things, and we want to be able to make decisions for ourselves. But then we sometimes need to put ourselves at the mercy of systems, institutions, countries, and so forth. When we extract ourselves from our home countries, and so all of a sudden, there's just more at stake than one's own abilities, desires, all that stuff doesn't matter. We're just often put in a lottery, we put in a basket and shaken around, and someone picks something out of it, and a lot of that just felt very degrading in a way, I'd say. And so that's where the title came from.
the title appears in a poem that's deep into your collection, a piece called Sieve. Could you read it for me? It's on page 56.
Okay, I was gonna say I have no idea where it is.
I'm sorry?
um, I was gonna say I have no idea where it is, but yes, I will. I will read it. Why am I still so insulted by visa lotteries that sift migrants? I, in particular. Do I think I'm above the seed hopper, the jostle to be one of the good ones? The amulet of meritocracy has failed, obviously. This is the junta of happenstance. I could return to the tracing of despair my country has become, or adopt the patience of the indentured, the grit of the gambler. 2 more years, and then we rest.
You started writing this book when you were living in the US. And what was happening? Where do these poems come from?
Mm. The poems that I write at every phase of my life um, generally reflect the circumstances that I'm in at that time, at those times, I'd say. And so when I started writing the poems in this book, 2017, I just looked back on my history and what was happening then. I had just been diagnosed with, an anxiety disorder and a mood disorder. I had very complicated feelings about that. Uh, I had just been denied an H-1B visa that would have allowed me to stay in the States for 3 years on a sort of work visa. And so I knew we either needed to go back in the lottery or leave. Um, I had recently, started to come to terms with, some of my past trauma and trying to trace how it led me where I eventually was. I was starting to look at geopolitics and how in every era some of the same patterns continue to replicate themselves. I was living in Donald Trump's America, in which my neighbors in Pittsburgh had voted in some interesting ways. And there had been that horror of what was unfolding. I'd initially thought this would never happen. And then it happened. And then, some of those immigration policies, eventually made things difficult for immigrants or migrants. I was never an immigrant in America. I was just on a student visa, I would say. Eventually made things very difficult. So that backdrop of turmoil, personal uncertainty, grappling with personal frailty, political unrest, um, a feeling of betrayal in the world, a feeling of unsafe, of being unsafe in a world that I was trying to craft comfort and safety within, a feeling of exposure, a feeling of needing to grapple with um, m- my internal chaos. I was having a lot of panic attacks at the time, and many of these poems are written during those panic attacks. So as a way to ground myself through those. Um, uh, a lot of all that, just really formed the background music, background track, or what have you. As I wrote these poems, and these poems helped me to sift through a lot of these notions and interpret them or transform them into something else. And so it was a personal exploration for me, but in many ways it was a healing journey for myself as well. A coming to terms. I was definitely a different person by the time I finished the book because I had I had I had solved some equations. I had solved some problems that I couldn't fully articulate, but I had moved beyond the concerns that I had before I started writing the book.
And at the end of the book, you were not only in a different place emotionally or psychically, but you were also in a different place physically, because by the end of the book, you were in Canada.
Yeah.
And was it difficult to get to, was it one more visa lottery business that they put you through, or was it hard to get to Vancouver?
It wasn't. I mean, we applied for a permanent residency and we were granted it, thankfully. And so we took a long drive from um, Pittsburgh to British Columbia with a U-Haul trailer hitched to the car. And some of the poems that I wrote, like there was this poem, "Settlers Effects," talking about some of the rest stops we encountered on the way. It was an interesting journey. Um,
Well, that's where interesting is the Chinese curse, because I mean, some of the rest stops were not, people didn't treat you very well. So,
they didn't, and some of it could be imagined, but didn't feel welcome at all of the rest stops. I'd say, and it was just that aura of suspicion with which I thought I was being viewed, and I hope I'm not imagining it, right? But other parts of the journeys were nice, and so the book is not in phases. I would say I would say that at every point of that 3 year period during which it was written, I more or less documented what I was going through, and so in a way, it's a flow. So even during the journey, I was documenting what was going through my mind, and so it's before the journey, during the journey, and after the journey. But some of the concerns are the same all through.
The image on the cover of your book is a photograph of a 16th or 17th century bronze sculpture. I'm not sure how visible this is, but
It's
it's it's of and by the people of the Benin Kingdom, part of what became present-day Nigeria. How does that speak to you?
it's a very evocative piece. I mean, growing up, we had a lot of images of the Benin bronzes, and we knew a lot of those were in museums around the world. Uh, when I was much younger, I didn't know how they came to be in those museums. But growing up, I learned a bit more about how the British destroyed ancient Benin and looted all these bronzes, and they made their way to auctions and so forth. Um, when I moved to America, I went started to go to museums in Baltimore, and other cities. And whenever I would go into the African art sections, I felt that's a strange sense of kinship because many of these had been they had weird provenance. Like some of these, couldn't quite trace where they came from. We just know it was one day in another country, and all of a sudden it arrived in North America. And some of these were frankly stolen, or obtained fraudulent. Um, and there's that diasporic feeling they gave off. It's like, oh, you're in a different continent now, and things are strange here. Same. Um, so there was that feeling. Um, there was also just the colonial injustice of it all, um, and the way the British Empire um, became the British Empire, or the way the British Empire perpetuated itself, with frankly treachery.
Mhm.
And moving to a country in which the British Empire did worse or similar, um, really brought a lot of it home to me, in that the effects of colonialism and empire generally are still with us today, and restitution still hasn't been made in so many of these cases. Anyways, spoke to me, but this particular image was just martial. It had martial tones, in that it demonstrated some of the conflict that I'm working through in the book, because I think ultimately the book is about it grappling with different forms of discomfort, and engaging with conflict, in different realms. And so there was that. And so I knew I wanted to point attention to that history. I knew I wanted a West African art object on the cover. Um, it was it was a question of which one. And so while searching, I happened on this one, and it was just perfect. Um, and so we went with that.
In the judges' comments about your book, they say that these poems emerge out of a lifetime intimate with death's randomness, and then they go on to say, and they make peace with accident and fate. Does that feel right to you? Have you made peace with accident and fate?
I don't know about peace. Um, I do feel that to militate against something, or to protest against something, or to deny, or to try to reverse the effects of something, you have to contend with the fact that it exists. I don't think denial is a good starting point for changing anything. And so acceptance. This thing exists. This thing is a problem. This problem doesn't feel nice. I'd like to change it. And so yes, so of course I accept that these things exist. But in a lot of my work, I am complaining about them. So it's not fatalistic. It is interrogating these things, saying, why does it have to be this way? And so forth. Um, anyway, that's my answer.
In that poem that I asked you to read, Civ, there's the line, "I could return to the tracing of despair my country has become." Would you go back to Nigeria?
I could, I will at some point. Um, will I be able to live there? I don't know. I wish I could. Um, I don't want to succumb to the usual um, trauma porn thing of saying, "Oh, my country is so horrible." But I frankly think Nigeria is a failed state. Um, that's the unfortunate truth. Um, and that pains me because yeah, I didn't need to be this way. And there's a part of every member of most diasporas that wished they could go back to their country. And many people in many diasporas don't necessarily want to be out of their country. They're not at home because of circumstances, happenstance. Um, they had to be thrust out of their lives, their families, everything they had ever known, built, and loved. They had to leave that. Um, that's not fun. It's a you know some people are voluntary exiles, involuntary exiles, refugees, people that are looking for economic opportunity, people for whom there's no more life or no more opportunity for them back home. And so I've left and I've seen things continue to deteriorate, um, and it's a devastating feeling. And so to answer the question, will I ever go back? I hope there's a country to go back to. I don't want to exaggerate. I don't want to make it look worse than it is, but it's not great.
Well, Canada is very glad to have you right now. And so, congratulations again for your writing and for being with us. Thank you.
Thanks.